I'm going to speak about my book for a moment or two. This is it, in the event, so you can recognize it when you're visiting your local finer bookstores. The title is The Strong Horse, Power, Politics, and the Clash of Arab Civilizations. And I just want to talk about the book for a moment or two, and then I want to talk about the administration's Middle East policy in relation to my larger thesis, and then I just want to hit at the end on a couple of recent news items that I think are of interest. The title, as you may recognize, comes from Osama bin Laden's line that people by nature prefer the strong horse to the weak one. When they look at a strong horse and a weak one, they prefer the strong horse. And what this is really about is my thesis is that this is sort of the baseline of how politics works in the region. This is what the political culture of the Arabic-speaking Middle East is fundamentally about. And this is really the focus of my book. It's Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, the Gulf. I don't go into the Maghreb, even though Iran is a central part of the book because of Iran's regional ambitions right now. I don't discuss Persian culture as such. It's mostly about Arab political culture, Arab society. I mean, one of the things that I thought was very important to explain to an American audience was the centrality of violence in a political culture like this. I think it's very difficult for most Americans to understand it. I think first of all, I should say that, in a sense, Arab political culture is no different from the way that most societies have been throughout the course of history, which is that political culture is mostly about violence, repression, and coercion. And we're extremely lucky to be able to conduct our own political lives for the most part, free of violence, repression, and coercion. And in a sense, I was really, in a sense, directing this towards what we might call the prestige intelligentsia, who I think don't quite understand these things a lot. They sort of take it for granted that political cultures around the rest of the world are more or less equal. This is not the case. However, one of the things that I wanted to say, I think there are a lot of people who are not on the liberal side of the political spectrum, but who may have made the same mistake. One of the things that happens in the book is I come out, I was in Lebanon during the course of what we've come to call the Cedar Revolution, from about right before the assassination of Rafiq Hariri to about a week and a half into the Hezbollah-Israel war. I left at that point, wound up in Israel. I still go back to Beirut quite frequently. I was back there last year 6 times. And as some of you may know who followed this, I mean, the March 14th movement and the Cedar Revolution is finished. And Hezbollah basically has de facto control over the country, which unfortunately proves my point, is that even though Lebanon is a democratic society, or the kernel of a democratic society, and even though the parliamentary majority, the majority in parliament was elected by Lebanese citizens who wanted some sort of democratic society. The fact is that Lebanon is held hostage by a bunch of guys with beards and guns. And that's the way that the region operates. That's how it is. I think in that context, it's very hard to promote democracy. And actually, during the course of my time in the region, I came out against democracy promotion for 2 reasons, and I'll talk about them quickly. First of all, in retrospect, the paradox is sort of obvious. When the Bush administration was looking at the region, and when it was looking at Osama bin Laden, it was quite correct to say a political culture that produces an Osama bin Laden is a political culture that is deeply troubled and deeply sick. However, the point is, if a political society like that creates a bin Laden, that means that that society is it's hardly susceptible to democratic remedy. This is a very, very difficult thing to do. And that paradox, again, I think the paradox is obvious in retrospect, but at the time it was not so clear. I mean, because bin Laden, again, I think the administration was basically correct. Its thesis is that bin Laden was not the exception, but rather the norm. If you look at the way the region operates, you have both the repressive violence of the regimes, and you have the terrorist violence of their insurgent rivals. And this is true throughout the region. The second reason why I think promoting democracy was very hard in the region and why it was destined to fail is because we were not willing to do, and I'm not sure that we should be willing to do enough to back it. But the fact is, if you don't back it, if you don't protect it, it's not going to happen. I saw this happen in Lebanon. all the time. Every time after there was an assassination of one of the March 14th political figures or journalist, Secretary of State Rice quite rightly pointed a finger at Syria and Syria's local Lebanese allies and said, we know what you're doing, and you must stop what you're doing. However, by not doing anything about it, what that means in the Middle East is you are only highlighting your inability to do anything about what you know is happening. Again, I'm not saying that the secretary necessarily should have done it, or the administration should have done anything, but if we were not willing to bomb Syrian military intelligence headquarters, democracy was not going to happen in Lebanon. I think in the same way, I'm probably considerably less optimistic than many of you in this room about Iraq. Even though I think the elections are a wonderful thing, I would very much like to see Iraq succeed, and I certainly hope I'm proven wrong. The fact is, it's not just Iraqi political culture. If you look at Iraq's neighbors for the last 7 years have had a vested interest in sabotaging Iraq. And not just Iraqi democracy. I mean, certainly they don't like that, but in sabotaging Iraq. They're fighting for their various interests in Iraq. At the time, that includes at this time, it includes the Syrians, it includes the Saudis, and it also includes the Iranians. This is an enormous issue. And this administration, the Obama administration, is worse than the Bush administration insofar as when Iraqi security officials, and now the re-elected Prime Minister Maliki, started pointing out, saying, we know who's doing it, it's the Syrians are doing it, and they're getting Saudi cover, and they're all together with the Iranians on this. What we've done instead, aside from General Odierno, who's probably been about the best, saying, we know that the Syrians are still involved, for the most part, this administration said, hushed them up, didn't want them talking about that. What's going to happen finally, my prediction, when we do withdraw our troops, the Iraqis are going to go back to a hard security state. They're going to go back to a form of Arab or Middle Eastern deterrence, which means, to quote Walid Jumblat, every time a car bomb gets sent into the Iraqi capital, what's going to happen is there'll be a car bomb threatened or one actually sent to the Syrian capital or to Riyadh. That's what will happen. That's how they will protect Iraq. What they'll have to do inside to protect it, they'll have to turn it into a relatively hard security state again. Maybe it's possible that some of these things can be pulled off with a modicum of democratic dressing, but I think in the long run it's probably unlikely. I did just want to talk about the administration for a second. Especially I wanted to note Vice President Biden's remarks yesterday in Jerusalem, where he was talking about how this is getting very dangerous for us, what you're doing. I mean, the strong horse principle is that in the Middle East, the only people who are entitled to rule are those who reward friends and punish enemies. You need to have a strong and powerful profile. The profile of this administration across the region is universally regarded as weak, and they're doing nothing to change it. No disrespect to Chicago, perhaps there are people from Chicago in this very room, but whenever I hear the fact that this administration is made up of tough guy, hardball Chicago politicians, like, really, is that how it works in Chicago? We sell out allies and we're nice to enemies? It's preposterous. I see no strong profile in this administration at all, not anywhere in the region. It's certainly the case with Iran. I mean, one of the problems that we have, let me walk this back for a second. With Secretary Clinton, when she was named Secretary of State, the first thing that we needed to understand is if the Middle East is an important place, the Secretary was going to be regarded, to be polite about it, with some sort of disdain by many Middle Eastern regimes. I certainly do not think that we should make appointments according to the racism and sexism and homophobia and whatever else you have it of Middle Eastern regimes. Nonetheless, if you're going to appoint someone, whether it's a man or a woman, they're going to have to be strong. And the Secretary has been humiliated by just about every Arab official, including both allies and adversaries. A couple of weeks ago, some of you may recall, Bashar al-Assad, mocked her after the State Department was talking about trying to drive a wedge between the Syrians and Iranians. Their response was to invite the Iranian president to Damascus, where Bashar al-Assad said, yes, I guess we didn't get the memo, or I got lost in translation, but we were going to have a separation agreement, but what we're doing instead is we're signing a visa waiver agreement. And this was after the week before, when the foreign minister of an ally, Saudi Arabia, said, when the secretary was talking about sanctions, Saudi Foreign Minister Saad al-Faisal said, said, it's much too late for sanctions. This is ridiculous. What are you talking about? He's right. As it turns out, I believe he's quite right. Nonetheless, the fact that our allies, our assets in the region, are showing up, American diplomats and American officials, is ridiculous. This is not good for our regional profile at all. I wanted to say something else which I hope is controversial, because I would like to be able to. I wrote the book with the idea of saying some controversial things. I just wanted to talk about Afghanistan for one brief second. I'll describe this in terms of how I hear it in the Middle East, especially in Lebanon. When people ask me, because in Lebanon you have, it's in a sense you have sort of a microcosm of the region. The Iranians, the Saudis, everyone's fighting it out there. Everyone has an interest. And so when I visit Beirut and people ask me, well, what do the Americans think about Iran? What's important? I say, well, right now, the Middle East, foreign policy isn't that big an issue, but the big issue for us is still sort of Afghanistan. And people are astonished. And frankly, it is astonishing that Afghanistan is a big deal. And I think it may seem that the strong horse principle would dictate that we need to stay and fight in Afghanistan. However, I think that's outrageous. There's nothing strong horse, there's nothing strong-willed or strong-minded about having your strategy dictated to you by adversaries. It's preposterous, the idea that if we leave, Osama bin Laden will run around the region saying that we lost. The Israelis went through this with Hassan Nasrallah 4 years ago. Hassan Nasrallah has been bunkered for 4 years. They lost. Hezbollah lost. Everyone knows it. We don't need to stay in Afghanistan to prove that Osama bin Laden is wrong. So I think that's an enormous issue. The two recent news items that I wanted to talk about. First of all, I actually hadn't been following this story, but someone mentioned it to me last night. Something about Jihad Jane. I wanted to say that these kinds of stories are a diversion, because another point that I make in the book is that the issue is regimes. The issue is the regimes that are fighting us. It's not a bored housewife somewhere in Philadelphia. It's not a major who goes mad in Texas. The issue is the different regimes. There's going to be crazy people popping up at all sorts of points who want to do bad things. The problem is these actual groups and the actual quality operations, as they call them, cannot be accomplished without the actual help of real live regimes. The Syrians, the Iranians, the Saudis. In different ways, all of the Middle Eastern regimes have a hand in this. So I think the stories like Jihad Jane, and we know what's going to happen now. There's going to be a proliferation of different people writing, as they've been doing for like the last 5 years, writing about the new wave of the terrorist threat comes from the internet. Comes from this sort of virtual world where people meet each other, where teenagers who no longer want to play video games now want to blow stuff up. This is not the threat. The threat continues to be Middle Eastern regimes and the work that they do with transnational networks. The final thing that I want to talk about is, the final news item is the Son of Hamas story. And maybe some of you have seen this. There's another book that's come out called Son of Hamas. Mossab Hassan Youssef, I think is his name. And as it turns out, this guy had been an Israeli asset for about a decade. He converted to Christianity, now he lives in California. To me, the very important part of this story is, if you've read the stories, and I really encourage you to go back and read the clips on him as he's talking about Christianity and his conversion. And I've actually spent some time in the West Bank with Muslims who converted to Christianity. It's not that rare. But if you read the different things that he said, you start to understand the difficulties of what our battle is in the war of ideas. We've come to accept that, well, we need to sort of promote different secular ideas, and we need to build girls' schools in Kandahar, and we need to do all these different wonderful things that are important to us. But when you're talking about traditional societies where religion is very important, the war of ideas takes place much more so on this level, talking about different religious ideas. I think that's an enormous issue for us. One of the things that I do in my book is I try to move the debate away from Islam, because I think we've been tremendously unsuccessful about talking about Islam. And nor do I think we are likely to have any success at this. Both the last president and this president continue to conceive of themselves almost as imams, talking about what the real Islam is like, who hijacked Islam, who has the real say over what Islam is like, the civil war in Islam, This is a secular republic. And the way that we should be talking about things is in terms of nation states, not the Muslim Ummah. The last president made that mistake, and this one is making the same mistake. Nonetheless, if you look at what the war of ideas looks like, what it really looks like, this is a very important issue. I think that's about it. I hope there are questions. I hope I raise some issues. You know, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is backed actually by every different Arab regime in a different way. For instance, if you look at Syria, the Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood is basically backed by the Jordanians, and the Syrians back the Jordanians branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's, you know, effectively deterrence. If you mess with our regime, we'll mess with your regime. That's what they're going to do, and they've been doing this for about 30 years. And if you look at Qaradawi is against the Egyptians, but he's backed by he's backed by Qatar. So all of these different people really, you know, they are in a sense backed and supported by different regimes, which is not to say that they love all these regimes. They fight them in different ways. So the regimes even have a hand in that. I guess one of the things is, again, I just don't know how we are going to be able to speak successfully about the different issues in Islam. I've seen that for the last decade we haven't done a great job of it. And I mean, and if you look at it, if I were a religious leader, if I were a priest, if I were a rabbi, I would say, how dare our political leaders enter this realm and start to talk about religion? This is not what we should be doing. So it's an interesting, it's fascinating for me. It's a fascinating debate. I just think strategically we've just failed at it really poorly. Yeah. Okay. Whether or not Arab Christians or you know Israeli Arabs living inside of Israel constitute sort of an enemy within. I mean, first of all, Bethlehem in particular. I mean, Bethlehem, from what I understand, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's now a majority Muslim town. I mean, and that was not the case just 10 years ago or something like that. It's an interesting issue. If you look at, I mean, this is one of the things that you see living in one of the sectarian states of the region, as I did in Lebanon. One of the things that you understand is when you hear a lot of the real sort of crazy ideological stuff, it comes from Christians. It comes from minorities. If you look at Edward Said, sort of the most famous, Arabist in American history, Said was a Protestant. But he sounded, in a sense, the anxiety to out-Sunni the Sunnis. This is one of the things that happens. And so if you look at some of the stuff that's come out of Gaza as well, what the different Christians have said, but they know who the problem is. Everyone knows who the problem is, and the problem is Hamas and the Islamists. And so they talk about it in terms of Israel. This is definitely part of their strategic communications campaign. Whether or not they're really a problem, no, I tend to think that the real problem inside of Israel is the Islamists. That's the issue. I mean, I can tell you about some of the very moving stories I had with some of the converts on the West Bank. I mean, I remember one guy said to me, you know, I mean, this was astonishing. He said, yeah, I converted around the same time. He was converted by a missionary guy, a Puerto Rican guy from the Bronx. And he said, I converted around the same time that my brother did. But we didn't know that we both converted at the same time. So, because that's how quiet you have to be, and that's how dangerous it is. But we both converted around the same time, and what we both really realized that we needed was love. And we weren't getting this. And I'm here with you guys in this car. Here we are talking, and I can't even go in my own hometown and feel free to speak. And now finally it's good because both my brother and I that we know that we converted. So there's a lot of different conversations going on. You know, about Palestinian Christians. I think the U.S. is going the wrong way on this. If you look at what's happening in the region, because the U.S. is I mean, you know, the Israelis have fought Iranian assets twice over the last 4 years. Everyone else, you know, the Arab states all recognize what's going on. The Arab states are all happy about this. They don't want, you know, they're very happy that Israel is doing that work. And right now they are looking towards Israel, since we've basically all but conceded that we intend to do nothing about the Iranian program, aside from try to contain it after the fact. No, I think the Arab regimes understand what's going on. As far as we're concerned, yeah, I think we're going the other way. Historically, though, if you look at what the real strategy is, in which it's not, right, it's not an Israel or the Arab situation. What it is that we backed the Israelis to let everyone know that if the Arabs wanted any concessions, they'd have to come to Washington to get them. So no, that was a very strong move to bind everyone together in a regional Pax Americana. So that was a very strong move. And you can make an argument that the peace process, a real peace, the peace process is in our interest, but a real peace is not in the U.S. interest, right? What else will the Arabs come to the U.S. for? So, I mean, I think right now we're going the wrong way on it, but historically, no. I think historically our actual strategy in the Levant, our strategy with the Arabs, our strategy with Israel, it's very sound policy.